Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is my second video in that series about academic training, academic work, different aspects of academic and scholarly life. In the first video, which was the previous one, I talked a little bit about reading articles, reading academic articles, and some ideas that we can consider with regards to reading articles, the pace at which we read, the reasons for reading. In this second video, based on a request by one of my viewers, Peyman, I'm talking about literature review, writing a literature review. And these are some ideas to remind us about who this is for. I have in mind master's and PhD students, early career academics, as well as ambitious undergraduate students. And one category that I forgot to include in the previous video was the category of independent scholars, people who are just interested to pursue some scholarly projects outside of the formal academic context. And also to refresh our memory, these are not advice. I'm not asking you to take what I say at face value and just trust it based on my authority. I want you to instead consider these ideas, to think about them, experiment with them, and possibly even reject them. And with that reflective, conscious rejection of these ideas, you might benefit in some other ways. And if you have suggestions for future videos in this series, let me know. I'm open to your suggestions. As long as I have something to say, I will be happy to extend the discussion in other directions. So without further ado, idea number one. So I think that there are prerequisites for writing a literature review. We're beginning to engage with research literature, having in mind the goal of writing a literature review. And I think before writing a literature review, we need to have a research question. This is, of course, quite obvious, but I think highlighting it is nevertheless useful. So we need a research question. And before having a research question, we need another thing, namely a research topic. The distinction between a topic and a question is, I think, also important and useful. Sometimes new students who want to do research with me under my supervision, they come and say, I want to study attention. I say, okay, let's come up with a research question. What is it that you want to, what kind of question do you want to ask within that topic of attention? So it takes some time usually for students to grasp that difference. A research activity, a research project usually is responding to a question or a set of questions. The question could be a very general question about the topic. So if you're studying attention, you can ask the most general question, what is attention? So that's one. Or you can, if you study boredom, the basic question about boredom is, what is boredom? That's a valid research question. It's a question about the topic in general, about that general psychological concept. But being aware of that is important. The reason why it is important to have a topic and a question is because we need these to be guided by them, to be constrained by them. Because we cannot read everything, our reading, our selection of readings, our selection of articles and books should be guided by our topic and our question. We need to be selective in a meaningful and in a systematic way. All right, second idea. This is a response to some people who might say, I don't have a research question, or I don't have a topic, so I don't know what to read. This idea says that you can begin reading even before having a topic, before settling on a topic, because you can begin reading in search of a topic. One of the reasons why we read is that we want to find a topic or questions that we resonate with, that we find inspiring or motivating. So just because you don't have a topic at the moment, it doesn't mean that you have to stay passive and inactive. Those are the same ways of saying the same thing. So you start reading in a relatively free way, relatively unguided and undisciplined way. That's okay, because you're searching. You don't know where to search first. So you pick an arbitrary point, pick a book, an article, a topic, or you ask your mentor, your advisor for some things to read. And after a while, after reading a few articles or a book or two, you suspect, you have an inkling that maybe you have found your topic. And you keep reading in order to confirm that suspicion. I think that this might be my topic. I think maybe daydreaming might be something I want to do research on this topic of daydreaming. Let me read a little bit more to confirm that suspicion. And I think your suspicion is confirmed that you really make it official. You're relatively official. You settle on the topic, confirm that when you are inspired, you find yourself inspired by a question or by a set of questions. You feel moved by these questions. So it becomes a little bit easier to continue reading, to continue taking notes, to continue working towards that goal in a project. For example, after a bit of reading, you might tell yourself, or you might tell your colleague or your advisor that I suspect that my topic is nostalgia. Nostalgia is I believe, a very interesting psychological topic, what it is, the factors that give rise to it or influence it. And let's say you read 10 articles and you say, I read 10 articles and I have now a question. This is not, you don't have to commit to this question. You can tentatively consider this question with an open mind. You can say, I might revise it later, but it's good to consider at least a question like this. For example, with regard to nostalgia, you can say, what is the relationship between nostalgia and socio-cultural change? You can explore that. You can continue reading guided by that question. Here I emphasize your question or topic can be revised as you continue reading and thinking. All right. Idea number 3. So you have a question, and I phrase that in terms of being equipped with a question. Now that you're equipped with a question, you can include and exclude articles from your literature review. You identify, based on your question, whether something is relevant and whether something is irrelevant. This is extremely helpful because you have to be very generous with what you exclude. Just because you have read something doesn't mean that you have to push it into your literature review. Feel free and exclude things that are not relevant to your article, because to fit something that doesn't belong to your literature review, it creates a lot of work for you. So this question, it's relatively obvious. You might feel like you don't have to ask questions like this because it's just too simple or too straightforward. But this question is, does this article belong to my review? Yes or no? And if it does belong to your review, why? Why does it belong? So you can begin answering these questions. And if it doesn't belong, why? So when you exclude some of what you read from your literature review, you're helping yourself bring in more organization into the eventual paper, eventual review. Review needs to be coherent, needs to have an organization, and it acquires organization. It becomes organized partly as a result of what you leave out of your review, what you judge as irrelevant. Again, another point that I should emphasize here is that your writing of your literature review can rest on that another foundational activity. That foundational activity is writing individual summaries of the papers you read, papers or chapters or books that you read. You continue writing those isolated summaries of the articles, and that serves as the foundation of the later piece, which is the literature review. So don't underestimate writing those individual summaries. And those individual summaries, maybe after you write them, you can then pose the question, does this belong to my review? Where does it belong? How does it belong? Or why it doesn't belong? This leads us to the next idea. So you can, of course, sit down and write your literature review from scratch, but it is possible. I would encourage you to consider going from your isolated summaries of individual articles that you have already written, move from those isolated summaries to a coherent and organized literature review. And the way you move from those isolated summaries to a coherent review is by discovering and constructing the literature review as a series of steps. So you realize you both discover what is, relatively speaking, a more foundational point. That would be your first step or second step. And what is relatively more closer to your own research. That's like later stages in the review. To put this in a different way, I wrote here in the third point on this slide, I wrote that a literature review is like a series of steps that are meaningfully organized, that you move from step 1, step 2, step 3. Then when you go back from these steps to the articles you have in your notes, you ask with respect to each article, where does this article belong in these steps? It is now helpful to give you an example. So this example comes from this paper I published a few years ago. with my friend Kristen Wilson and one of my mentors at the University of Toronto, Susanna Ferber, Professor Susanna Ferber. Now, this is I think, a useful example because the introduction to this article that we wrote is quite short. It only has 7 paragraphs. So when you read these 7 paragraphs, if you read these 7 paragraphs, it is easy to identify the steps in the literature review. So just let's look at the very first sentence in this introduction, how we open the article. So the very first sentence is this: visual attention arises from the interaction of multiple distinct neural networks. That's it. This is the idea number 1, or the step 1. I'm just saying here, that the visual attention relies on the function of not just one neural network, but multiple neural networks. And now I want to go into further steps talking about what these neural networks are, where are they located in the brain, and what is the function? What is it that the current neuroscience literature believes their function of these separate neural networks that are relevant for attention, the function of attention. So here I should point out that Corbetta and Shulman belong to step 1 in my literature review. So I identify the place of this article, Corbetta and Shulman and Posner and Dehaene, as belonging to the very first step in my literature review. In the next step, now I'm getting into more details of one of the neural networks that support attentional function. Temporoparietal junction is one brain region that belongs to a network. And now we are talking about here the suppression of TPJ, suppression of temporoparietal junction. This is I didn't count the number of steps, but let's say it is in step 4 or 5 of my literature review. And it is written in the 3rd paragraph in the introduction. And here the main article cited is Emmerich and colleagues 2011, as well as Todd and colleagues 2005. So now that you have these ideas, you can read your own articles, the articles that are relevant to your work, while identifying the steps in their review. What is the first step, and what are the more foundational articles that they are citing, and what are the less foundational articles that are mentioned in the later stages of the review. All right, the 5th and last idea. This is a little bit about the strangeness of this concept of literature review. And I believe that we have this concept of the literature review as a byproduct of how psychology functions in our time, contemporary psychology, contemporary mainstream psychology. I would argue that literature review, this concept, is a child of empirical psychology. It is a product of an overemphasis, too much emphasis on empiricism in psychology, data collection and reporting new data. Because what is the meaning of literature review? What are we doing, or what are we claiming to be doing in the process of a literature review? We are showing a process of finding the so-called gaps in the existing literature to motivate and justify our own research. So we are saying that the research that I'm doing now, our group is doing a kind of research that needs to be done, that has a genuine motivation for it. And to show the motivation, to show the justification, I'm going to do a literature review to show the gaps in the literature and show where my work fits into that gap. In other words, a literature review is an expression of lack, or an expression of tension or paradox or incompleteness, plus your own promise, or our promise that in this article, in our own research, we are going to fill these gaps or resolve these tensions or complete these incompletenesses. What does that mean? What is one implication of that? The implication is that literature review doesn't itself do any work. So there's no genuine, real contribution that you are making in the literature review. The literature review itself is just an expression of lack, an expression of what is missing. And in addition, literature review is isolated in a very artificial and arbitrary way. It is isolated from the other parts of the paper, and it has its own title. The title is literature review, separated from where you talk about your methods and where you talk about your results and your discussion. So these artificial separations itself is worth paying attention to. There are alternative ways of thinking about literature review. It doesn't have to be a part of your paper that doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't do any work. And alternative ways of thinking about literature review are possible. You can think about a review as something that itself does something, that itself gets some work done. For example, you can find while you're doing your literature review, while you're reviewing the relevant literature to your project, to your topic and research question, you can find inconsistencies in the literature and just analyze these inconsistencies and their meaning and the implication and the consequences and the root of those inconsistencies. That itself is a very interesting way of exploring a topic. You can also find hidden connections that exist between various aspects of research. You can look at an area of research in psychology or in social science, and you can identify places where some aspect of a method, there's something about the researcher's method that is shaping the findings, that is shaping the arguments that the researchers are putting forth. And they don't want us to pay attention to that part of their method. They want to almost hide that aspect of their method. So something that you can do is you can bring into light those aspects of the method that researchers themselves don't emphasize. They don't want you to pay attention to. And you can kind of rewrite previous research with a shift of emphasis and talk about how if you shift your emphasis in the way you read previous literature, you can draw new and different conclusions. And another related point is you can draw new connections that don't exist. So if you're interested in these kinds of alternative ways of engaging with literature, I would direct you to one of my previous videos that is titled simply Why Theory? Commentary on Thomas Theo's paper in 2020. In that paper, I talk about these three distinct aspects of theoretical work in psychology and how theoretical psychology can make these distinct contributions to psychological thinking. So here, this way of thinking about literature review isn't separate or separable from your research work. So you don't have to do your literature review and then you do your work. No, your literature review itself can accomplish some work. For the first time, I think I became aware of this possibility that you can accomplish something just by thinking about existing research was in a paper I wrote with Julie Ardron and Jay Pratt, published in 2014. I stumbled upon a new interpretation that was possible on one of the previous research papers on a topic I was writing about. It had to do with electrophysiological findings, a reduction in P200. We don't have to get into it, but I made a connection, and it was really exciting for me that I could just look at existing literature and draw connections based on what already exists. Because sometimes researchers are so fast and a little bit unreflective, and they don't draw some of the important connections that they can make. So what you can do is you can slow down a little bit and discover some of the connections that the researchers themselves didn't make, or they didn't want to admit, or they were in too much haste to think about all the implications of their work. A recent book chapter that I read is also non-empirical. It's just a theoretical contribution. It's really good. It's a chapter titled Why Science Needs Intuition. It has a really strong historical dimension, about the history of the treatment of this concept of intuition and how people in the past and people in the present think about the relationship between reason and rationality on the one hand and intuition on the other hand. The author is Professor Lisa Osbeck. It's a chapter in the book on hijacking science, which I might talk about in a future video. That's it. If you enjoy my videos, I'll encourage you to check out my Patreon. I have some videos about my own life in academia, my academic training. I also have a little reading group you can join. I also offer mentorship and conversation and study tutoring. Thank you for your attention. And again, if you have suggestions for future videos, feel free to share them as comments below. And otherwise, I'll speak with you in future videos.